Hello and welcome to Niterania YouTube channel. My name is Branislav Berec, and in this video we're going to learn how to play the expansion for Karak 2nd edition called Karak Chaos, published by Albi. It's still for 2 to 5 players. The recommended age is 10 years or more and plays in about 45 minutes. This Karak expansion called Chaos contains 5 modules. You can include any number of these modules with your base game. You can add all of them together if you want, or you can add just 1 or 2. It's completely up to you. And in this video, we're going to explain all those 5 modules one by one. So without any further ado, let's get started. So the first module we're going to talk about is the new buildings module. It contains 15 new building tokens and these 5 replacement tokens. First of all, when you play with this module, take these replacement tokens, these glory banners, and replace the old glory banner token from your player board with this new one. Note that this new one has a significantly reduced cost. Then, when all players replaced their glory banners, return any remaining glory banners back to the box, and now players will draft these new buildings. Starting in the reverse player order, so if this is the first player and this is the last one, then going from yellow through green to purple, each player selects one building. Let's say we will choose this one. If the building has any associated dice, take those dice as well. And now replace one of your buildings with the new building token. For example, we will replace this one with the new token. Now, any dice associated with that building are placed in the general supply, and the replaced building can be returned back to the box. Then it's the next player's turn. That player will choose one of the buildings and use it to replace one of their old buildings. And finally, the first player does the same. And now there will be another round, but this time it goes from the first player to the last player. So in our example, we have the first pick, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Note that some of these buildings have 2 copies in the game. However, you may never have 2 copies of the same building. So for example, if you draft a merchant building, you may not draft another copy of that same building. Once all players have drafted 2 buildings, return any remaining building tokens back to the box. These new buildings follow the same rules as the buildings from the base game. In order to build them, you have to use the build action and pay the indicated cost. When you do, flip the token to the other side, and now you can use that building. And now let me briefly explain the effects of all these new buildings, and we will start with these buildings at the bottom. These buildings are called elite unit buildings. They allow the owner to train these special elite units. These units follow the same rules as the standard units from the standard base game. However, there are only 2 dice available for each building. When you lose the unit, it comes back to the general supply and you can recruit that unit again. And each of these units has 1 special icon. And now I'm going to explain all these icons for all these buildings. So this is a basilisk lair. In order to recruit a basilisk, you need to pay 2 stones. These are the standard sword symbols. You can find them on most faces of the die. However, when you roll this symbol, it means that the basilisk dies. So you have to return the die back to the supply. However, for each skull that is resolved, you add 1 sword to the final result. So for each unit lost, for each life lost, you add additional sword. Note that you get these additional swords only when these skull symbols are actually resolved, which means when you roll them and they are somehow prevented, for example by the amulet of protection, then you don't get these additional swords because those skulls have not been resolved. Then this next building is a colossi factory. It allows you to recruit these colossi. Each of them costs 1 wood and 1 stone. It's a very powerful unit. You can roll up to 4 sword symbols. However, when you roll this symbol, you must perform the colossi reconstruction, which means you either have to pay the stone or the Colossi unit dies. Then this is a Griffin's aviary, and it allows you to recruit Griffins. Each Griffin costs 1 food and 1 wood. Again, it's a very powerful unit, and when you roll this symbol, the Griffin dies, which means you have to return the die back to the supply. However, you add 1 basic unit for free to your army, so knight, archer, or a mage. Then with the next building, you can build these minotaurs. They cost 2 food. Again, these minotaurs can be very powerful. You can roll up to 4 swords, and when you roll this symbol, you must either discard one of the other dice rolled, or you must discard the minotaur. When you discard dice, you can discard a die with the skull symbol. If you do, you can keep the minotaur die. And finally, with this building, you can build sentinels. They cost 2 wood. It's another powerful unit. You can roll up to 4 swords, and when you roll this symbol, the sentinel dies, so you return the die back to the supply. However, it prevents all other skull symbols in that roll. Again, note that in order to prevent those other skull symbols, the sentinel must die. If the death of the sentinel is prevented by the amulet of protection, for example, the sentinel doesn't die, then other skull symbols are not prevented. So you must sacrifice a sentinel, it must die in order to prevent any other skull symbols in that row. And now let's take a look at all the 5 remaining types of buildings. This is inn. When you build inn in your city, you get 1 resource of your choice at the beginning of your turn. Then this is a citadel. When a warband, which is this token, I'm going to talk about them later in the video. When these warbands are laying a siege to a city with a citadel, then the strength of that warband is lowered by 5 each time before it destroys a building. Additionally, each player who enters a landscape tile with a city with a citadel must pay 1 resource of their choice to the owner of the city. However, that player must end the move in the city with the citadel. If they just went through, the effect is not triggered. Then this is a hospital. The player with the hospital built in their city is not affected by the plague and misery effect resolved by other players. Also, when you perform healing, it heals all hit points, not just 2. Then this is a monument. When you build a monument in your city, you gain an ability of one of the other heroes. So, for example, you say that you gain the ability of the green player, and you gain that ability in addition to your own ability. And finally, the trading post allows you to trade resources 1-to-1, which means you can take any of your available resources, return it back to the supply, and take any resource from the supply. You can do this as many times as you want, and usually you do this during the recruit or build action. However, as a cost of the transaction, you have to pay any 1 resource of your choice back to the supply. And that's it. Those are all the buildings and all their effects in the game. And now let's move to the next module. The second module is the merchant module. It introduces these 2 merchant landscape tiles and some items which you can buy using additional action. That new action is associated with these landscape tiles. First, take these tiles and shuffle them into their respective decks. And when this merchant landscape tile is drawn and placed on the table and it's added to the map, don't place any monsters on this tile. Warbands also avoid this merchant tile. No city, no shrine can be built here, which means these merchant landscape tiles will always remain as the merchant tiles. So when it's added to the game board, these 6 types of items are available for purchase. These tokens have a slightly different shape, so they're not added to the bag. You don't gain these items by defeating monsters, you gain them using a new action on the merchant tile. The action is called purchasing items. You obviously must have your hero on that tile. And you can buy as many items as you want as long as you have the resources required to purchase those items. Once you purchase an item, it follows the same rules as any other items in the game. When you replace or discard them, they are placed on the space with your hero. Now, these are weapons, they add 1 or 2 to your roll. This is a fireball spell, it adds +1 strength. After you use this scroll, return it back to the purchasable items. And now, these are 3 amulets. This is the amulet of protection, which I have mentioned already in this video. It prevents 2 skull symbols during the combat roll. This is the amulet of glory. If you have this amulet, it adds additional 2 glory as long as you have that amulet. And this is the amulet of action, and the hero with this amulet has 1 extra action. The next module is the Warbands module. It introduces these 3 fallen city landscape tiles, 3 Warband dials, and 3 Warband tokens. First, shuffle these landscape tiles into their respective decks. And then, when during the game the fallen city landscape tile is drawn and placed on the table, add it to the game board. Don't place any armies on that tile. Instead, add the Warband dial of the corresponding color, set the value to the maximum number, in this case it's 10, and the coat of arms of the same color is also placed on that tile. Now, the dial represents the warband and the coat of arms will represent the target city. Thematically, the warband will choose the city. It will be the strongest player in the game. The coat of arms token will be placed in that city, and the warband will try to find a way to that city and then lay a siege. The fallen city tile is a special tile, which means no city or shrine can be built there. No monster can enter that tile, and so on. And now let's take a look at how the warband chooses its target city. First of all, it must be a city which doesn't have any other token, like the Plague and Misery token or potentially any other Warband token on it. If there are more such cities available, then the player with the most soul tokens becomes the target. If players are tied, then the player with the highest glory. If tied, the player with the most buildings built in that city. If still tied, if we have the first expansion, it's the player who has the Emperor. If not, the player with most dice in their pool. If still tied, the player with the most resource tokens in their pool. If still tied, roll the player's dice. And then the player with the lowest number of sword symbols becomes the target of the warband. If still tied, continue rolling until one player has fewer sword symbols than the other player. So in our example, it's the yellow player, place the warband token on the yellow city, and then if the yellow player has the warband on their city, at the start of each yellow player's turn, first move the warband, and only then you can continue with your turn. I'm going to explain how to move the warband in a second, but first let me clarify some special case here. If you're unable to find a target for the warband, for example when there is no city built or there is no city without any other token, then the warband will sit on that falling city landscape tile until another fallen city landscape is added to the board. In that case, first identify the target for the previous warband and then identify the target for the new warband. If you add a fallen city landscape tile and you are not able to identify a target for the warband and there are no other fallen city tiles available, meaning there is no other fallen city landscape tile to be drawn, simply discard the warband with the warband token without any effect. One more clarification, the player who drew the fallen city landscape token will have to engage in a battle with the warband, and furthermore, the player who became the target of the warband cannot receive any other token, so this player is safe from any plague and misery effect. Now, as I said, at the start of each yellow player's turn, the warband dial, the token which represented the actual warband, must be moved. The dial must be always moved one tile closer to the target city. The warband movement always ignores these chasms. However, they may never enter the Karak castle or any other player's city. They may never enter a merchant landscape tile or any other special landscape tile. For example, the Stone Eater's Mines or the Goblin Cave. So in this example, this token cannot go through this city or the castle or the merchant landscape tile. And you must always try to find the shortest way to the target city. So in this case, the warband dial would be moved like this. Now, when there's no valid movement for the warband, all these three hexes block the movement of that warband, then the warband stays on the current tile. On any other subsequent move of the yellow's player, if there is any possible way for the warband, it will move on that turn. Once the warband reaches the space which is adjacent to the target city, on the subsequent turn it doesn't move, but it lays siege. Now let's take a look at battle with the warband. If the warband enters the space with the hero may immediately move into a space which is adjacent and doesn't contain any monster, or the hero can stay in the same space, in the same hex, and then engage in the battle. The warband is considered a monster for any purposes, any abilities, and the fight, the battle with the warband follows the same rules as the battle with any monster army, with a few exceptions. At the beginning of the battle, the hero loses 1 life, just as in the battle with the Dark General. And as a result of the battle with the warband, lower the strength of that warband by the strength of the hero's attack. So if the hero's attack was 7, for example, then lower the strength of the warband by 7, so it goes from 10 to 3 in this situation. Even if the hero doesn't fully eliminate the warband, it gets 1 resource of their choice for every 3 points of the strength of the warband they have managed to lower. So in our example, it's 2 resources of your choice. Then, if the hero attacked the warband and the warband was not eliminated, the hero must return back to the space from which they attacked, or if the warband entered a tile with the hero must retreat to any eligible space, and if not, they must return back to their city. If that's not possible, or if the city is not built, then they must move back to the Karak castle. The hero also gets a glory for fighting the warband. They can increase the glory to the strength equal to the damage dealt to that warband. So in our example it was 7, unless you had already higher glory than that number. If you manage to fully defeat the warband and bring their life to 0, then you take the dial as a reward because it shows the soul token or tokens, and you add these tokens to other soul tokens you already have. The warband token is then discarded. If there's a warband and the monster in the same space, their strength is added together, just like when 2 monster tokens are in the same space. However, unless both the warband and the monster are defeated, the player cannot get the rewards for the monster. They still get the reward for the warband, but they must defeat both tokens to also get the reward for the monster. When the warband dial arrives at the space which is adjacent to the target city, on the next turn it doesn't move, but it lays siege. Here's the procedure. If the attacked player has a citadel, the warband immediately loses 5 points of strength, so in our example from 7 down to 2. If the strength is reduced to 0, the warband is eliminated and the target player gains the Warband dial with this soul token. The target player also receives any rewards, for example gaining the glory, as if the target player simply dealt 5 damage to that Warband. Then, if the Warband still has any strength remaining, the target player must choose one of their buildings and flip that building back to its unbuilt side. Now, the number of resources required to build that building is the amount of damage dealt to the Warband. Here we have 2 resources, food and wood, so that's 2 damage to the Warband, which now brings the strength of the Warband to 0. That's another damage inflicted to the Warband, so sum up the damage from the citadel plus the damage from the building. In our example, it was 7. If your glory was less than 7, you can bring it to 7, so you gain the same rewards as if you beat or defeat that Warband in the standard battle. If you have no buildings built in your city, then the Warband destroys the city itself and loses 2 points of strength because the city itself requires 2 resources to be built. And if the Warband still has any points of strength remaining, they now choose another target. If no valid target is available, it stays in its place and waits for another fallen city landscape tile to be added to the game board, and then it chooses another target, as we already explained. If all fallen city tiles have been placed and the Warband doesn't have any target available, simply remove it from the game. The next module contains these new 3 Chaos Rider bosses. These bosses replace the standard Dark General, and when you play with these new bosses, it is recommended that you use the new buildings with them. In addition, you can set aside this final tile, you will not use it. Instead, shuffle these fallen city landscape tiles into their respective decks, even if you don't use the warbands, because each of these bosses have a banner which corresponds to one of the fallen cities. Every time the fallen city landscape tile is drawn, a corresponding Chaos Rider boss is also drawn. If you play with warbands, both the warband and the Chaos Rider spawn on the same landscape tile, and the battle with the Chaos Rider follows the same rules as the battle with the monster armies, and the player who defeats the Chaos Rider gains the indicated number of soul stones as a reward for his defeat. Note that the reward for this Chaos Rider is 5.5 of the soul stones. The game ends immediately after all 3 Chaos Riders are defeated, even though some of the warbands may still be in play. Then the player with the most soul stones wins the game. And the last remaining module are 2 new heroes. This is Hannah the Acrobat and this is Sidhar the Alchemist. Hannah has this eagle flight. She can move by 2 landscape tiles instead of 1 and cross chasms in the path. However, she cannot explore new territories this way. She must still move from adjacent landscape tile. And with this ability, the Master Thrower, she can place weapons into these spell slots. Once the weapon is used during the combat, it is discarded or placed back into the merchant tile area if it was purchased. The Alchemist has the airship city. The city is flying, and at the beginning of each of the Alchemist's turns, the Alchemist can move the city by 1 landscape tile, so move it to another adjacent tile. Obviously, following the standard rules, you may not move it to any space with another city, with a Karak castle, with a monster army, warbands, and so on. If the Alchemist is in the space with that city, the Alchemist can move with that city for free. In addition, this ability is called Cannonade. Alchemist can pay resources to get additional swords. For any 2 resources, he can generate 1 additional sword. You can do it maximum twice, so you can spend maximum 4 resources to get 2 additional swords. So that's how you play Karak Chaos, the expansion for the second edition of Karak. If you have any questions or comments, I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. My name is Branislav Berec. Karak Chaos is published by Albi, and hope to see you on the next one.